Say those four names out loud. Go on, do it. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Notice what just happened. Not the sound of the names, though that is worth attending to. Notice something more specific. You said those names with complete confidence. You have been saying them your whole life. You have never, in any ordinary context, felt the need to check whether those names belong there. They arrived with the texts. They came packaged together, inseparable the way an author's name appears on the spine of a book. You assume the same logic applies. Now listen carefully. Because what Baruch Spinoza found when he opened those four texts and looked for those four names inside them, not on a cover, not in a header, not in a later title someone attached, what he found inside the actual text of each gospel is the thing you were never told in a pew. Not one of those four writers named himself. Not once. In any of the four texts, the names you just said out loud were hidden from the text that supposedly carried them, added, placed above the words by someone else at a different time, for reasons that have nothing to do with the original act of writing. And when you understand how those names got onto those books, when you trace the precise historical mechanism by which four names were attached to four anonymous documents circulating in early Christian communities, you will not be able to read a single verse the same way again. I want to show you what the evidence shows, not what the tradition says, what the manuscripts actually contain. And then I want to show you who attached those names, when, and why. Because the why is the part that does not resolve comfortably. It is the part that stays with you. There is a word in Greek, 2 syllables, kata. It means according to or after the manner of. In the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, the four Gospels carry superscriptions, titles written above or before the text, that read Evangelion kata Mattaion, Evangelion kata Markon, Evangelion kata Lucan, Evangelion kata Ioannan. The Gospel according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. Hold that word kata. We will come back to it, because those 2 syllables tell you more about the origin of these names than almost anything else in the manuscript record, and this is the part that no one in the pew is ever told. Let me start with what the texts actually contain. This is where Spinoza started, and the argument has to begin there. Open the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9, verse 9. Jesus is walking along and he sees a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. He said to him, "Follow me." And the man got up and followed him. Read that again. A man named Matthew. He sat, he followed. Third person throughout. The narrator of this gospel describes Matthew from the outside as a figure observed, the way you would write about someone else. If Matthew wrote this gospel, if he sat at that tax booth and followed Jesus and later wrote down his memory of it, he would almost certainly have written it differently. I saw him walking. He spoke to me. I got up. The shift from third to first person for events of this kind of personal significance is not a matter of style. It is a matter of basic narrative logic. The author of Matthew writes about Matthew the way someone who was not Matthew would write about him. Mark opens differently but reveals the same absence, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Pure declaration, no authorial signature, nothing that gestures toward a named individual writing from personal witness. The text begins and proceeds through its entire length without the author introducing himself. Luke is the most interesting case. Luke opens with a formal prologue, the most carefully composed opening of all four Gospels, clearly written by someone with formal Greek rhetorical training. The author addresses Theophilus, most excellent, and explains that he has carefully investigated everything from the beginning. A first-person voice, a sophisticated, educated voice, and then not one syllable of the author's own name. He introduces his method, his purpose, his source material. He does not say who he is, not in the prologue, not anywhere in the gospel that follows. The most self-aware narrator of the four, the one who most explicitly describes the act of writing, never once names himself. John is pure theology from the first word. In the beginning was the Word. No author, no introduction, no biographical anchor. The beloved disciple appears, unnamed, a figure the tradition eventually identified with John. But the author never identifies himself with this figure explicitly. The name John does not appear as the author's self-identification anywhere inside the body of any of these four texts. Four texts, 4 presumed authors, 0 internal signatures. And stay with me, because what comes next is where Spinoza's methodology becomes impossible to dismiss. Now here is what that tells you about the word kata. I was doing some translation work in the mid-1990s, preparing material for a New Testament Greek course, a graduate seminar, the kind of work that requires sitting with actual critical editions rather than translations you have taught from a dozen times before. I had spent the better part of a morning in the seminary library, a reading room on the north side of the building, where the October light came in flat and gray and without warmth. That particular silence that reading rooms enforce not through rules, but through the collective weight of concentrated attention. I had a critical edition of the Greek New Testament open to the Gospel of Matthew. First page, and I found myself stopping at something I had looked at probably 200 times without really examining. Evangelion kata Matthaion, the superscription above chapter 1, verse 1. The kata stopped me that morning in a way it had not before. The tea I had made at the entrance table had already gone cold. Think about how you title your own work. Your name appears where you put it. You sign your work because you are the author, and you are identifying yourself as that. Now think about the phrase according to Matthew. What kind of person uses that phrase in reference to their own text? If I write something, I do not title it according to Malcolm. That formulation makes sense from the outside. It is the language a classifier uses, someone who found a text without an author's name and is attributing it, according to what someone who knew Matthew once passed along, according to the tradition of his community. I began comparing the formulation against other ancient documents I was familiar with, library attributions, the way texts were identified in Alexandrian scholarship, and the pattern held absolutely. According to is the language of someone labeling a text from the outside, not the language an author uses to introduce his own composition. It is the difference between writing a book and being found to have written it. That is the answer. Simple, almost obvious once you see it. But wait, because if the kata superscriptions are external labels rather than authorial signatures, the question becomes, who attached them? When? And what did they base the attribution on? Those questions have answers, and the answers span approximately 150 years of early church history, 150 years during which those names were considerably less settled than the tradition has ever wanted to admit. I need to take you somewhere important now. Pay attention to a name and a date, because this is where the argument shifts from the evidence inside the texts to the evidence outside them, and the gap between the two is the thing that does not close. The first name attached to any of these texts in the documentary record comes from around 130 of the Common Era. A bishop named Papias of Hierapolis, a city in what is now Western Turkey. His writings do not survive directly. What we have are quotations preserved by Eusebius of Caesarea in his 4th century church history. Eusebius was himself in the business of establishing the orthodox lineage of the texts, which is worth bearing in mind as a context for what he chose to preserve. Papias says 2 things. He mentions Matthew first. Matthew arranged the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone translated them as best he could. Here is where it collapses. Our Gospel of Matthew is not in Hebrew or Aramaic. It is in Greek. And it cites the Old Testament consistently using a specific Greek translation called the Septuagint, not the Hebrew original. In every single quotation, if Matthew had written in Aramaic and someone translated him into Greek, the translator would not have systematically replaced the Hebrew citations with Greek Septuagint versions. That is not how translation works. The Septuagint quotations are the original author's compositional choice, built into the theological argument of the text. Our Gospel of Matthew was composed in Greek by someone who worked from Greek sources. It was never an Aramaic document that someone rendered into Greek, which means Papias is describing something else entirely, possibly a collection of sayings that circulated in Aramaic and was associated with the name Matthew, a document that no longer exists. The text Papias describes and the text we call the Gospel of Matthew are not the same document. The attribution has slipped from one thing to another across a gap of generations, and the 2 things are not identical. Papias also mentions Mark, that Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote down accurately all that he remembered. The Gospel of Mark has Aramaic words preserved inside it: Talitha Kumi, Ephphatha, Abba, consistent with someone working from an Aramaic-speaking tradition. But if Mark was the personal secretary of Peter, faithfully transcribing his eyewitness account, the resulting document would carry Peter's witness at its center, his specific memories, his voice. The Gospel of Mark does not read like that. It reads like a narrator constructing a story from existing oral traditions. The account of Peter's denial, in particular, one of the most personally painful moments in any gospel, is narrated with the flat external perspective of someone working from a story they heard, not a wound they watched. Spinoza had a name for this mechanism. In the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, he called it the attribution of anonymous texts to authoritative figures, communities assigning the names of prestigious individuals to texts that carry no internal authorial signature, to give those texts a weight they could not otherwise claim. The Proverbs of Solomon, the Psalms of David, the Book of Moses. The practice is pervasive across ancient religious literature, and it is operating here in the New Testament with the same logic for the same institutional reasons. But Papias is 130 of the Common Era. A gap of 100 years separates the event from the first surviving external attribution of authorship to these texts. During that 100 years, these texts were circulating, being copied, being read in communities across the Eastern Mediterranean, and the attributions were not fixed. So I want to show you something, a gap in the historical record that has never been satisfactorily explained, because it is not Papias alone who reveals how unsettled this question was. It is the 50 years between Papias and the man who finally closed it. Justin Martyr was writing around 150 of the Common Era, among the most important apologists of early Christianity, a philosopher convert who wrote defenses of the faith addressed to the Roman emperor himself. He quotes from the Gospels extensively, and he refers to them as the memoirs of the apostles, a collective unnamed category, not the Gospel of Matthew, not the Gospel of Mark, not 4 named texts with 4 named authors. In 150 of the Common Era, the individual attributions we now take as foundational are not yet clearly in place. Then there is the Muratorian Fragment. Most scholars date it to around 170 of the Common Era, 20 years after Justin, 10 years before the man I am building toward. An incomplete document, its beginning lost. What survives begins partway through a discussion of Luke, which it calls the third of the Gospels. But the section discussing Matthew and Mark, the first and second Gospels, is gone. The document is damaged at its opening. We are in 170 of the Common Era, and the explicit systematic naming of all 4 Gospels is still not visible in the surviving documentary record. I need you to hear this carefully, because what comes next is not speculation. It is the primary sources themselves. Papias at 130, describing texts that do not match what we have. Justin Martyr at 150, using collective language. The Muratorian Fragment at 170, fragmentary at the critical opening. Then, at 180 of the Common Era, a single bishop who names all 4 explicitly and argues for why there must be exactly 4. And his argument is not historical, it is cosmic, it is numerological. The man who settled the attribution is the man I need you to hear. Against Heresies, a massive polemical work by Irenaeus of Lyon, written around 180 to 185 of the Common Era. Irenaeus was a bishop working in what is now southeastern France. He wrote Against Heresies as a systematic attack on Gnostic Christianity, specifically against Valentinus and the theology of Marcion, whose Christianity relied on Paul's letters and an edited version of Luke, stripped of connections to the Hebrew God. I want to quote him directly. Book 3, Chapter 1. Irenaeus writes, "It is not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer in number than they are. For since there are 4 zones of the world in which we live, and 4 principal winds, while the Church is scattered throughout all the world, it is fitting that she should have 4 pillars, breathing out immortality on every side. For the living creatures are quadriform, and the Gospel is quadriform. And there are 4 principal covenants given to humanity, and therefore 4 Gospels. I need you to stop here. Read that argument again, slowly. There must be exactly 4 Gospels, because the world has 4 corners, because the wind comes from 4 directions, because the cherubim described in Ezekiel have 4 faces, because there have been 4 covenants between God and humanity. 4 zones, 4 winds, 4 Gospels. That is not a historical argument. It is numerology. It is pattern matching between the structure of the cosmos and the number of authoritative texts the author needs there to be. Irenaeus does not produce documentary evidence for who wrote each Gospel. He does not cite first-century testimony attesting to authorship. He argues from the geometry of the universe. 4 because 4. I was at a conference on patristics some years ago, a field in which I am a visitor rather than a specialist, as I should be clear. It was in the north of England, one of those institutional buildings where the corridors between seminar rooms are long and drafty, and the coffee at the mid-morning break has been made by someone who regards warmth as optional. I found myself standing near the tea table with a colleague whose entire career had been devoted to the Church Fathers, someone who had spent 3 decades reading Irenaeus in the original Greek, who had produced critical commentary on substantial sections of Against Heresies. I raised the 4 winds argument, not aggressively, with genuine curiosity about how someone who had given their professional life to this period understood what Irenaeus was doing in that passage. He paused, set down his coffee cup, looked at a point slightly past my shoulder. Then he said, "The 4-zone argument is what you might call declarative. It tells you what Irenaeus needed to be true, not what he discovered to be true." He picked up his cup, looked down the corridor. After a moment, almost as though to himself, he added, "It is not the kind of reasoning that would satisfy a modern historian." And then we talked about something else. I stood there a moment longer than the conversation required. Declarative. An argument used by the first man to name all 4 Gospels systematically, described by a specialist who had read him for 30 years as declarative. Not evidential, not based on historical research. The cosmic framework a bishop assembled to justify a number he already needed to reach. And what Irenaeus was really doing was not scholarship. It was strategy. And I will show you what that strategy was for. Now the third thing. This is where it becomes almost impossible to avoid the conclusion Spinoza drew. 3 things the texts show about their own authorship. The third one stopped me completely. Matthew. The author of Matthew quotes the Hebrew scriptures more extensively than any other gospel writer. The recurring formula, this happened to fulfill what was written through the prophet. Every single one of those quotations comes from the Greek Septuagint, not from the Hebrew original, not from the Aramaic that a Galilean Jew would have known, from a Greek translation produced in Alexandria centuries before the birth of Jesus. The man identified as Matthew was a Jewish tax collector in Galilee. A Jewish man in first-century Galilee who knew his scriptures would have known them in Hebrew and quoted them in Hebrew. The systematic use of the Septuagint points toward an author for whom Greek was the primary language of scripture and thought. Not a Galilean who had walked the roads of Palestine. John, Acts of the Apostles, chapter 4, verse 13. When the Jerusalem authorities observe Peter and John, they are described in the Greek as agrammatoi, unlettered, without formal education. This is the community the tradition places behind the Gospel of John. Now read the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Logos. The Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. This is not folk theology from a fishing village. This is the Greek philosophical tradition. Logos as cosmic reason, vocabulary that comes from Heraclitus, from the Stoics, from Philo of Alexandria. The author of the Gospel of John was working at the intersection of Jewish scripture and Hellenistic philosophy in a way that requires formal intellectual formation. The community Acts describes as uneducated Galilean fishermen, and the text that opens with Johannine Logos theology are products of entirely different intellectual worlds. And then there is Luke. The author of Luke and Acts, and they are clearly by the same writer, is the most literarily accomplished writer in the New Testament. The Greek is controlled and varied in a register that marks someone for whom Greek rhetorical composition was a primary formation. The prefaces are written in the high literary mode of someone who had read Thucydides and understood how a historian positions his investigation for an educated Greek-speaking audience. This is not the prose of a Mediterranean craftsman writing from memory. It is the prose of a trained writer, working within the established conventions of ancient historiography. Apply Spinoza's method to each of these 4 texts, and you arrive at the same conclusion in each case. The internal evidence of language, vocabulary, theological formation, and compositional choices does not support the traditional attributions. The attributions came from somewhere else, and I need to tell you where, because it is not accident, and it is not innocent error. In 180 of the Common Era, when Irenaeus was writing against heresies, the Christian textual landscape was not 4 Gospels, it was dozens of texts. Communities across the Mediterranean read different things and treated different texts as authoritative. The diversity of early Christian textual practice was not a deviation from an established norm, it was the norm. What I'm about to tell you is not speculation, it is the documented historical record. The Gospel of Thomas, with its 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, no crucifixion account. A Jesus who teaches the kingdom as a present reality available to anyone who removes what obscures it. Communities read it as authoritative. The Gospel of Mary, in which she is the primary post-resurrection witness, and Peter's authority is explicitly challenged, not as a heretical fringe text, but as a text with genuine theological standing. The Gospel of Truth, written by Valentinus himself, and Valentinus, according to an ancient source, came close to being elected Bishop of Rome. These were not the writings of isolated extremists. They had communities. They had theologians who wrote commentaries on them. They occupied the center of living theological argument. Irenaeus was writing against specific people in a specific contest, against Marcion, who had built his Christianity from Paul's letters and an edited Luke, against Valentinus and his followers, whose theology the emerging Orthodox movement needed to exclude in order to consolidate authority. The naming of exactly 4 Gospels, these 4, written by these 4 named figures with apostolic connections, was a move in that contest, not a discovery, a strategy. It is not incidental that the Gospel of Thomas, which contained no resurrection narrative in the form Irenaeus needed to defend, is not among the 4. It is not incidental that the Gospel of Mary, in which the authority of Peter is explicitly questioned, is not among the 4. The selection reflects the requirements of a specific theological position in a specific historical conflict. The names were not discovered, they were assigned. Assigned as part of a contest in which the stakes were the definition of Christianity itself. Spinoza understood the mechanism. In the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, he wrote that the authority of the prophets depended on their power to persuade. The authority of these 4 texts depended in part on the names attached to them, apostolic names, names of men who walked with Jesus, who witnessed the events the text described. You do not need to prove that Matthew wrote Matthew once everyone believes Matthew wrote Matthew. The belief becomes the authority. The name closes the question before the question is asked. What Irenaeus created in Against Heresies was not a historical finding. It was an institutional settlement, a declaration of 4, backed by cosmic numerology. 4 because the world has 4 corners, 4 because the wind comes from 4 directions. Designed to close a theological contest that had been running for 150 years, and to close it in a way that excluded every text whose theology threatened the authority of the emerging Orthodox institution. Those excluded texts existed. They have been recovered. The Gospel of Thomas has been in print in serious academic translation for decades. It contains sayings attributed to Jesus that do not appear in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. You were not told about it in a Sunday sermon, not because the connection was unknown, but because the boundaries placed around authoritative Christian reading in 180 of the Common Era were doing the work they were designed to do, and have continued doing it for almost 1900 years since. I do not know how to tell you that the 4 Gospel authors were anonymous in a way that leaves the texts themselves unchanged. Reading them, knowing that no one inside them named himself, is a different experience from reading them as the testimony of 4 specific individuals who were present and signed their work. It changes the quality of attention the texts demand. It changes what questions you are permitted to ask. The texts remain what they are. The Sermon on the Mount is in one of them. The parable of the prodigal son is in another. The opening of John, with its extraordinary claim that the Word was present at the creation of everything, is still what it is, regardless of who wrote it. But there is a difference between engaging with these texts honestly and reading them through names assigned a century and a half after the events they described by a bishop who believed there could only be four because the universe has four corners. A bishop whose argument a specialist who spent 30 years reading him called decorative, not evidential, not historical. The man who argued for four winds and four gospels was also the man who excluded the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary from the list of texts that Christian communities could legitimately read. His numerological argument and his exclusions were the same act. The cosmic geometry justified the number. The number defined the boundary. The boundary determined what was inside and what was outside legitimate Christianity for the centuries that followed. I am not telling you the four Gospels are worthless. What I am telling you is that they are human documents, written by Greek-speaking members of early Christian communities, working from oral traditions and earlier written sources, sometime in the second half of the first century, attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by a process that took 150 years, ended with a bishop arguing from cosmology, and was designed to close a theological contest the emerging Orthodox institution needed to win. Human documents deserve to be read honestly, not through names placed above them by someone who believed the four winds required four Gospels, but as what they actually are, the work of people trying to preserve a tradition that mattered enormously to them, under pressures that shaped every choice they made. Spinoza read them that way. He was not diminishing them. He was insisting on the honesty they deserve. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Say the names again if you want. They have been attached to those texts for a very long time, long enough that almost no one thinks to ask where the attachment was made and by whom, and what argument was used to justify it, and what other texts were excluded at the same moment. The manuscripts will tell you if you are willing to ask them the right questions. Take care of yourselves.
If you know someone still trapped in religious fear, someone who needs to know the historical truth, share this with them, anonymously if you have to. Sometimes one video changes everything.